Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our Microsoft Azure webinar. Today we will be joined by John Garidis from Byte Software Services and Dan Scarf from .NET Solutions, who will be going through the webinar with us.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. I'm John Garidis, and I'm the Cloud Lead at Byte Software Services, and with me today is Dan Scarf, who is the founder of .NET Solutions. So what I'd like to start is with a definition of the cloud. Quite often when we meet customers for the first time, they ask us to define what cloud is. So cloud is everywhere, is coming to define everything we do in IT. It enables people like ourselves to work from anywhere, whether at home or whether we are traveling or in the office, using devices that we like and running applications we are familiar with, and equally important, are accessing data in a secure manner. Cloud also is for developers. It enables them to use the tools they're familiar with and languages they have learned without having to learn any new languages. And at the same time, it helps developers to actually run dev and test and UAT environments at the click of the button. At the same time, the IT managers, it frees them from actually maintaining and supporting large infrastructure on-prem, patching systems or setting up servers overnight at weekend, and instead focusing in what is business critical and actually develop applications to help the business move forward instead of focusing on patching systems and servers. So what do we know? People decide to move to the cloud for three reasons: speed, scale, and economies of scale. So let's start with speed. Purchasing new servers, setting them up and configuring them, it takes a lot of time, especially if you have to integrate to your own environment and infrastructure. In Azure, you can set up applications and have them run and start building on them very quickly, literally in minutes. Scale. If you think about when you start building an application, you start in a traditional way. You start by purchasing all the hardware and software, then setting it up, configuring it, and then start using it. But you never start using the full infrastructure that you build for, because initially the applications you are developing are not ready for production. At the same time, if you are a retailer, or if you, let's say, you are running an application such as tax return, there are peak and troughs in the consumption of your infrastructure. With Azure, you can scale up very quickly without having to rely on purchasing and provisioning your own hardware and software. At the same time, economies of scale. If you are expecting your application to start slowly and then build later as it gains momentum, you don't need to build that infrastructure initially, but you just provision it as you need it. And in Azure, you get charged by the hour, or by the minute. Literally, your VMs are charged by the minute of usage. And in such a way, you can actually build your infrastructure gradually and get charged accordingly. However, once you decided that you want to move to the cloud, you want to consider the strategy and how does this impact your own data center, and what are the workloads you should be moving as fast as possible. So let's start with technology trends. According to a survey that was done by IDC, 70% of the CIOs said they were going to adopt cloud by 2016. And this was an independent survey. And the reason they cited for moving to the cloud is, as we said, the benefits is obviously speed, scale, and economies of scale. Speed. One of our customers was able to deliver solutions within 2 weeks versus what used to take them before, which was 6 to 12 months in a traditional way. And that's HarperCollins, one of our customers. Another customer wanted to scale from a site that used to accommodate 30,000 hits per day to 250,000 visitors. And that was again instantly done by the auto-scaling feature in Azure. And when it comes to economies of scale, even Microsoft themselves, the BI team in Seattle, were able to save $75,000 by using the cloud infrastructure. Now, if you're thinking about Azure maturity, you need to think that about 430 billion plus there are Azure authentications happening in that platform, and we've seen a year-on-year growth of almost 300%. Also, what we have seen over the last 3 years or so is 50% of Fortune 500 organizations now use Azure. So you're in safe hands, in other words. Now, what we have also found when we speak to customers is that before they move to the cloud, they have some concerns. And those concerns tend to be around security, from the design of the infrastructure, the network, identity, to privacy and compliance. In fact, what we've noticed is that it was a study carried out by Comstor back in 2013. What we noticed that pre-adoption, there were 60% of the people interviewed cited concerns around security as a barrier to adoption, and 45% were concerned about the lack of control that they would have if they would lose if they go to the cloud. After adoption, after they start using Azure, in fact, 94% experiences a better security benefits than they had previously on-premise, and 62% said the privacy protection increased as a result of moving to the cloud. And then, of course, if you think about it, the reason is that when companies use Azure, they benefit from Microsoft's scale and experience in running highly secure and compliant online services around the globe. Don't forget that Microsoft services run in Azure, and they need to be secure and safe for everyone. Now, you are in safe hands. There are a lot of customers that have adopted Azure, and you can see some global names in this slide. I only need to mention from our experience HarperCollins, our own customer, Aston Martin, Tesco's, and many others, as well as public sector organizations are using Azure. As you can see, some of the testimonials. Now, another interesting survey, again, it was an independent survey carried out by Morgan Stanley, and that basically looked at customers adopting cloud services and what were the different vendor preferences. And as you can see, 4% were OpenStack, a few of them around Rackspace and CloudStack, but interestingly enough, only 12% cited Amazon Web Services. But by far, most of them cited as Azure as the preferred vendor for using the cloud infrastructure. So not only you're in safe hands, but a lot of your competitors and people in your organizations are thinking about moving to Azure. Now what I do now is I'll pass you over to Dan to delve deeply more into the Azure infrastructure.
So Azure is made up of hundreds of thousands of physical servers based in data centers all around the world, and if any of you ever get the opportunity to go out to one of these data centers, I would highly, highly recommend it. They're some of the most impressive facilities that you can ever see around the world. So everything you'd expect in terms of a modern data center design, in terms of redundant power, climate control, state-of-the-art security and access control. I had a great story once about one of the VPs from Coca-Cola that tried to go to one of these data centers, but hadn't brought his ID with him and tried the whole, don't you know who I am, but they wouldn't even let him into these data centers. Very, very secure. And that kind of picks up on some of the stuff that John was talking about in terms of the some of the stuff John was talking about in terms of the security and the access control around these facilities are way in advance of some of the stuff that you can do on-premise yourselves. One of the other interesting things is the innovation that's going on around the design of the data centers from a power efficiency standpoint. The Azure data centers are some of the most power efficient in the world, which again translates into the reduced costs and the economics of scale that you can get by using the cloud. There are over 2,000 people inside Microsoft engineered in cloud infrastructure, designed and operations, and over $2 billion roughly it costs for each one of these data centers that Microsoft creates. So again, sort of if you want to see real evidence of Microsoft's commitment to the cloud, just look at the amount that they're actually spending building these physical facilities. So whenever we're looking at a cloud provider, one of the most important things to look at is platform availability. As we hand over control of these services to a third party, we're going to start to live and die by these SLAs. So as you look at cloud providers, that's one of the most important things that you have to look at. With Azure, we see between 99.9 and 99.95% financially backed service level agreements across all of the services. If we fail to hit those SLAs, there's a very, very rapid ramp off to give you a very big percentage of your spend back as part of that service level agreement. We have high availability both within each one of the data centers and across different data centers. So there are various services which you can actually deploy in a highly available configuration across multiple data centers. We have service isolation across virtualized compute and virtualized network. So one of the other concerns about moving to the cloud is, are we exposing ourselves to security risks from other tenants in that cloud service? The way that Azure has been designed from the ground up makes sure that all of the different tenants are fully isolated from each other, and it's virtually impossible for anyone to gain access to other tenants' infrastructures. And on top of that then, as we come out to the internet, there are multiple lines of defense, multiple firewall solutions to make sure that everything you do is nice and secure. When these slides were done, there were 8 major data center regions. There are a couple of new ones which have just opened up, which we'll look at on the next slide. 24 content distribution networks. We've got replication within the data center and across data centers. And then as we start to move up into platform services, again, even more redundancy, which is all done for you behind the scenes. The final piece to talk about is compliance and disaster recovery. So all of the physical facilities that make up Azure have amongst the tightest compliance and the greatest number of certifications that are out there. So things that you'd expect, such as ISO 27001, EU Data Protection Directive. We're a business associate agreement holder with HIPAA in the US for their healthcare data, SSAE 16, and 3 or 4 other major standards, which again goes back to this point of it's much easier for the cloud providers to certify their data centers to take advantage of all of these standards, and often you'll find that these facilities have far greater accreditations than what it's possible for you to do on premise. From a government perspective, we have IL2 in old money, or official as it now is in the new world. We also have PCI DSS compliance, so you can store credit card details up there. We have BISMA in process across a number of the different services. That's another US federal accreditation. And we've got compliance with all of our different services on the very near-term roadmap. Okay, to the next slide. So in terms of the geographic breakdown of all of these data centers, we have 4 regions at the moment in the United States. We have Dublin and Amsterdam serving us here in Europe. We have a region in Brazil which went live about a month ago. We then have Hong Kong and Singapore in Southeast Asia. We have a joint venture with a company called 21 Vianet, so we have public cloud facilities available in China. And then we have 4 new regions, East and West Japan and East and South Australia, which are again coming online within the next few months. So a huge amount of investment that's being made into these data centers. Azure is available in 89 markets worldwide, so you can pay for it in your local currency. Microsoft's history and heritage, of course, is in the enterprise, so 24/7 by 365 enterprise grade support and different support offerings dependent on the kinds of workloads which you're planning on putting in Azure. And again, to give you an idea of how fast this is growing, the amount of compute and storage which Microsoft has within its data centers is doubling every 6 months. So that's an unbelievable rate of growth. Next slide. So let's go a little bit deeper and talk about, just hang on a second, sorry, I'll run through these one at a time. Let's go a little bit deeper and talk about some of the different services which are available on Azure. So the first one is virtual machines, and the name is a bit of a giveaway in terms of what that is. So think of virtual machines as almost identical to what you're doing on-premise today in your virtualized or private cloud environments. Virtual machines gives me the ability to log on to the Azure portal and just create machines as I choose. So we support a whole variety of different operating systems, so everything from Windows Server 2008 R2 upwards, but also including a number of Linux distributions as well. All of these virtual machines can have a number of hard drives attached to them, so we can leverage low-cost Windows Azure storage, so you can present up to 16 separate disks onto these machines. And then once we've created the machines, we can then put load balancers, firewalls in front of them to protect those machines from the internet. The next level we have is moving into something called platform as a service. So with virtual machines, we have full control of those virtual machines, but we also have full responsibility for those VMs. So we have to install the OS on them, we have to patch them, we have to look after them. So we have full control, but also full responsibility. As we move into cloud services or platform as a service, what we have effectively is an abstraction away from the underlying operating system and the applications which are running on those servers. So if you're creating internal software, so you have a development team, for instance, and you're building a new line of business application, perhaps something that's doing some modeling, rather than having to actually deploy that software yourself onto the virtual machines, you can use things called cloud services, where Microsoft will take responsibility for deploying those applications for you. They're still based on virtual machines under the cover, so you still can customize those machines, but you're a little bit more limited as to what you can do. The nice thing about cloud services is we don't have to worry about patching the OSs, and most importantly, we don't have to worry about deploying our software. If we're working in an agile development fashion, we might be launching new software every week, and that becomes a serious challenge for your operations team to keep on top of. Using cloud services, we can just upload a new version of that application, and Microsoft will automatically deploy that across all of the virtual machines, across all of the different data centers. The next piece we have is websites, and with websites we are moving one layer further away again from the operating system. So the best way to think about websites is IIS as a service. So again, I might have an internal development team, or I might have a website which I've currently got hosted with another traditional hosting provider. With websites, I can just pick up that code and images and all of the pieces which make up that website, and I can just drag and drop it straight into Azure, so no changes need to be made to your application whatsoever. And then once that website is deployed onto the website service, I can then very quickly scale that website out across a number of different servers all around the world. We can also support a number of content management systems as part of that, so things like WordPress and Braco, Drupal, about 30 open source content management systems which you can deploy automatically onto websites. We also support deployment from a number of different mechanisms, so you can FTP your website to us, you can deploy it from GitHub, or you can deploy it from services such as Visual Studio Online. So again, we can get this automated deployment method working, which vastly increases your developers' productivity and makes it a lot easier to release new versions of your software. As we're running on IIS, we also support all of the languages which IIS supports in terms of ASP.NET, Python, Node, PHP, Ruby, Java, a whole bunch of other platforms as well. So the next thing we have is a service called mobile services. So if you are interested in building any internal line of business applications, or perhaps you want to launch a new mobile application to your customers, using mobile services we can create effectively a back-end as a service. Mobile services supports all of the major handsets, so Windows Phone, iOS, Android, Windows Store applications, iOS tablet applications, Android again, or HTML5 and JavaScript. So We can build those applications ourselves, or we can use technologies such as Xamarin, which is a cross-platform development studio for writing iOS and Android applications in .NET. So once we've created that front end, we can then talk to Azure Mobile Services to then do all of the behind-the-scenes stuff, which traditionally we would have to manually code. So if we look at things such as persisting data, Mobile Services has a data persistence layer, so those applications can read and write data without you having to write lots of code. We can also do user authentication, so if those applications that you've written, you'd like users to be able to log on with their Facebook or Twitter or Microsoft or Google or even their internal Active Directory credential, Mobile Services will do all of that translation for you, so you can literally just drop one line of code in and enable user authentication in your applications. And then the final piece then we have our push notifications. So again, if you want to deploy an application which is going to notify the user that something has happened, in the old world we'd have to write all of those different notification systems for all of the different platforms ourselves. With Mobile Services, it's a layer that sits on top of all of the platform-specific notification services for you. So they're the high-level services. So if you're looking at deploying things into Azure, it would probably be on one of those four main areas. Behind the scenes, though, we also have a whole bunch of other services which are available for you to leverage. So the first one of those is storage. So we saw storage earlier when we were talking about where the virtual machines store their hard drives. But you can also leverage storage in a whole number of other scenarios as well. So if you want to, for instance, store data from your application, you can have your application talk directly to the storage service. We can also make that storage available from on-premises environments as well, and we'll come on to in a second a device called Store Simple, which allows you to do that. But think of storage as effectively just an enormous SAN in the cloud. You can store as much data as you want on a low per gig per month basis. The next platform service we have is SQL Database, and the name's obviously a bit of a clue in terms of what that one is. Now we have two mechanisms to deploy SQL into Azure. We can either create virtual machines and we can install SQL on those virtual machines. We can either bring our own licenses or we can buy the licenses as part of the per minute cost. But in that model, you're responsible for setting up SQL, you're responsible for making sure that it's all working properly. With the SQL database service, actually what we're getting is a database as a service. So effectively, Microsoft will run big clusters of SQL servers in the data centers all around the world, and you can then just say, I'd like a SQL database, please, and I would like it to be able to perform 200 requests per second. And off the back of that, then there will be a cost per month for that particular database that includes all of your SQL licensing costs, all of your high availability, all of your backup, everything. So it's a much easier to consume SQL service. Next thing we've got is import and export. So if we're looking at moving large quantities of storage or large SQL databases to the cloud, we need an ability to be able to get that data up to the cloud. You can of course send that over your internet link if you like, or alternatively you can BitLocker encrypt a physical hard drive and FedEx that to the relevant data center, and we will then ingest that content into your secure storage area. Next service we've got is HD Insight. So this is our big data offering, and any of you familiar with that area will probably have heard of Hadoop, which is what all of the major consumer cloud services use. So our implementation of Hadoop is called HD Insight. So HD Insight effectively allows you to find that needle in the haystack. It allows you to process vast amounts of data and get insight from that data. So one of the customers that we've been working with on that is ASOS. I'm sure you've all seen in Amazon the people who bought this also bought this. What ASOS have done is take it one step further and actually imported all of the log files from all of their web servers into HD Insight, and then can actually say, well, people that clicked on this link also clicked on this link. And you can imagine the weblogs from a site like ASOS.com is an enormous amount of data, and to be able in real time to provide that kind of mechanism to pull out those insights and pull out those recommendations, really demands a cloud service like Azure. Next thing we've got is SQL data sync. So if you've got a database running on Azure and you want to be able to synchronize that either with another SQL database running in another data center, or even to replicate that against a database which you're currently running on premise, you can use the SQL data sync to allow you to do that. Alongside that, we've got recovery services, and we'll come on to recovery services in a bit more detail in a second, but effectively that allows you to do disaster recovery and high availability solutions from your on-premises environment up to Azure. If you don't want to go to the level of something like that, we also have a more simplistic backup service which you can use to back up Windows Server 2012 machines. It's very similar to the backup software which is built into Windows, but what it allows you to do is then to target Azure as that backend for that backup. So it's a proper offsite backup. For any of you that are using Data Protection Manager as well, that will also seamlessly connect to Windows Azure Storage. So if you're looking at a replacement for your tape solution within DPM, again, encourage you to have a peek at this so you can effectively just pump off that last piece of long-term archive up to Azure. And we also support a number of other backup solutions as well, which you might be running. The final piece we have is our caching service. So if you're running applications on Azure and you want to increase the performance of those applications, you can hook into our cache service, which will allow you to do that. Next piece we've got are around network services. So any of you who are familiar with Server 2012 might have played around with the new software-defined networking within that. Azure is built on top of that same platform, same software. So within Azure you can create virtual networks, so effectively grouping together these virtual machines, cloud services and websites. So even though they're spread throughout the data center, they appear as if they're on a local network and can talk to each other seamlessly. Final piece we've got then is Traffic Manager. So if you're deploying, for instance, a website across multiple different data centers, you'll want the ability to be able to move traffic backwards and forwards between those data centers. It might be based on the location of that user. So if they are in the Far East, you want to send them to a data center in the Far East, or it might also be on availability. So if one of the data centers does, for whatever reason, go down, you can automatically fail traffic across onto one of the other data centers, which is still up. We've then got some application services. So these are services which you might want to hook into within an application which you're writing yourself. So the first one we've got are notification hubs, and notification hubs allow you to consume data from lots of different devices and then broadcast messages based on those notifications that you might have been getting. So if any of you are looking at things such as the Internet of Things and you want to collect data from smartphones or from sensors, notification hubs allows you to process millions of different messages per minute. Next piece we've got is Service Bus, which is a kind of similar solution. Service Bus is all about allowing you to access on-premises resources. So if you don't want to go the whole hog and publish a whole network to Azure, you can publish individual services. So EasyJet, for instance, are making extensive use of this to publish systems from within airports to allow them to be consumed from mobile and PDA devices. It can also work as an enterprise service bus. So if you've got lots of different applications which are listening for different message types, you can put that onto an enterprise service bus using the service bus feature within inside Azure. Next piece we've got is Visual Studio Online. So we touched on this earlier as part of websites. So if any of you have got internal development teams and you're using Team Foundation Server on-prem today, Visual Studio Online is effectively a cloud version of Team TFS. So all of your users can collaborate in real time using this backend, and then you can also connect this backend directly up to services such as websites, so you can automate your complete application lifecycle management. Next thing we've got is media services. So any of you who have anything to do with video distribution will probably know the pain of in transcoding that video to work across a number of different platforms and potentially be viewed by hundreds of thousands or millions of users around the world. Media services is a complete shrink-wrap solution that allows you to ingest high-resolution media assets and then go through a workflow where we might be transcoding it, we might be digital rights protecting it, we might want to put it into a catalogue of media assets, and then we want to deliver that asset out to a range of different devices via a content distribution network. Media Services complete turnkey solution to help you do that, and it's actually what is powering the new Office video service in Office 365. So in a similar vein to Service Bus, we have something called BizTalk Services. So again, if any of you have felt the pain of having to run BizTalk internally, you'll know it's a great solution and very powerful, but a little bit difficult to set up, shall we say, and sometimes a little bit difficult to manage. BizTalk Services is BizTalk as a service. So you can just create your workflows and create your message types and transformations, upload that to Azure, and we will then run that for you as a service. Underpinning almost all of these services is Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory is an extension to your on-premise Active Directory. It doesn't today replace it, but what it allows you to do is a whole bunch of different things around identity. So we can use Azure Active Directory to do single sign-on to other cloud-based services. There are over 2,000 cloud services which we support today. So if you're using solutions like Salesforce or Box or Google Apps or any number of other cloud services, you can use Azure AD to perform that sign-on for you, so users aren't prompted for credentials and you can control access to those third-party solutions. We also support multi-factor authentication, so if you're running RSA tokens at the moment, you can potentially retire those and use Azure AD. And we also provide rights management, so if you want to secure access to content, so you're using 365, you want to send a secure email, you can use Azure Rights Management, part of Azure AD, to allow you to do that. Next thing we've got is the Azure Store. So obviously Azure has a whole bunch of capabilities, but there are certain things which it doesn't do. A good example would be email services, for instance. So what we have is a store where you're able to buy third-party services and include those within your Azure subscription. So for email, for instance, you can buy SendGrid straight through Azure, and it's just part of your standard commercial agreement. There's hundreds of applications and services which you can get through that store. Final couple of things we have are scheduler. So if you want to schedule something to happen on a regular basis, you can set that up as a job. So think of scheduler almost like a task manager within traditional Windows. And then the final piece then we have is content distribution network. So if you have assets that you want to place on your website and make that available to users around the world, you can put it onto the CDN. And the last bit is multi-factor authentication. So again, this is part of Azure Active Directory, but if you want to have people have to provide a second form of authentication, that can all be delivered as a service now from Azure. As we said earlier, Azure is one of the most open platforms that's out there, so whatever your applications are built in, whether it's .NET, Java, PHP, Node, Python, a whole bunch of other languages, they're all fully supported on Azure. Azure's probably one of the first platforms from Microsoft that's really demonstrated this new open approach that we're seeing through Satya. It's not just about Microsoft technology. We recognize that customers have a whole range of different solutions inside their organization, and please don't think of Azure as a Microsoft solution. It's a solution to host any technology which you run inside your business today. So, as we mentioned earlier, Azure is a cloud platform, one of the most open and flexible cloud platforms that are out there. You can build applications using any tool or language. You can integrate it with your existing IT environment, and in the next slide we will see a bit more about how we do that. Also, go back, Sarah. We've got a 99.95% monthly SLA, and if you're using our cloud services, so things such as websites, we've got automatic OS and service patching. Everything that we do on Azure is based on usage-based pricing. So John mentioned earlier, it varies from service to service as to how those are charged. With your networking services, things such as ExpressRoute provide you the ability to automatically connect your internal network up to Azure, and those services are typically priced on a per month basis. As we then move up into storage, all of these services are charged on the amount of storage that they are using. So with SQL database, for instance, what's the size of your database? With HD Insight, what's the amount of data that you're processing? And then with tables and blob storage, again, just the number of gigabytes of storage in each one of those services. With compute, we think more along the lines of virtual machines. So even though we have varying layers of abstraction away from the underlying service, they're still priced on a server basis. So VMs, websites, cloud services, you pick a size of virtual machine, and depending on the size of that virtual machine, you will be charged accordingly. All of these services are on a per minute basis. Storage is on a per hour basis, I forgot to mention. And then the final piece, app services, these, to be honest, vary based on the service. So things such as media, for instance, is based on the number of gigabytes of video assets which you transcode. Identity is based on the number of users within your identity store. Service bus can either be priced based on the number of messages which are being transferred or the number of hours that your connection is open to your on-premises environment. So I encourage you to work with your integrator to fully understand how all of this is priced up. But you know, the great thing is you're only ever charged based on what you use. So I don't know whether any of you keep a track on Gartner, but if you have been, you'll have noticed that Microsoft is currently a leader in fact, 4 now of Gartner's Magic Quadrants. So if we look at the server virtualization Magic Quadrant, we're just behind VMware. If you look at IaaS, we're just behind Amazon Web Services, and if you look at PaaS, we're just behind Salesforce. If you look at enterprise storage, which is the one which isn't on there, we're actually the top dog for that one. So not only is Microsoft the only provider that is in all 4, or leaders in all 4 of these quadrants, Microsoft is in fact the only vendor that even appears in 4 of them. In fact, the only one that appears in 3 of them. So you know, Microsoft really has done a great job the last couple of years in lining its ducks up. And if you're looking at a strategic enterprise platform, you know, Microsoft is a great bet. Although there are some vendors that perhaps have some slightly better solutions in certain areas, if you're looking at a platform across the board that will cover all of your enterprise IT requirements, Azure and Microsoft are definitely well worth their consideration. So we talked earlier about how Azure works alongside your existing on-premises environment, and if I had to give one reason why I think Microsoft is the best story for your enterprise, it would be our hybrid story. There are certain other vendors in the market that will tell you, you know, either you get cloud or you don't, either you're in or you're out. Microsoft takes a very different approach to that. We understand that you will have services on-prem, and you'll continue to have services on-prem for a good amount of time. So what we try and do is to make sure that there is as much synergy as possible between our on-premise offerings and our cloud offerings. So we have on-premise business continuity, we have our Azure backup and site recovery, we have on-prem AD, we have Azure AD, we have Hyper-V, Windows System Center virtualization on-prem, we have Azure IaaS in the cloud. We have on-prem traditional storage, and we have Azure Store Simple. We've got on-prem hybrid networking, and then we've got express route to expose that out to the cloud. So whatever you're doing, it's very easy for you to move between these two different worlds as and when you feel comfortable doing. So we saw earlier all of the Azure data centers, but again, this hybrid approach doesn't just mean working with solutions on-premise, it can also mean working with other solution providers, because this is a consistent technology stack which we run inside our data centers, which you run inside your data centers, is also available to hosting partners as well. So if we go to the next slide, we will also see, along with the Microsoft data centers, there are a whole bunch of Cloud OS network providers. So these are perhaps more traditional hosting companies that have deployed Microsoft cloud hosting solutions into their data centers. So if there isn't an Azure data center where you want one, you can work with a Cloud OS network partner to get a consistent experience across these different worlds. So let's talk about a couple of specific scenarios. So storage is one of the challenges that I'm sure you're all facing at the moment. Typically organizations see a 40% year-on-year growth in demands for storage. And if you look at your storage infrastructure today, it's probably fairly complex, it's probably fairly expensive, it's probably based on a whole bunch of different services, a whole bunch of different hardware, and you're probably hitting resource constraints and starting to outgrow what you have today. So storage today is complex and expensive. So Microsoft has a unique solution. We touched on this earlier. Microsoft acquired a company called StoreSimple a couple of years ago, and the best way to think about StoreSimple is a traditional SAN. It's a physical piece of equipment which you can put into your data center, stuffed full of hard drives, but you can talk to that without any modification to your existing applications. This is just a standard iSCSI SAN which you can drop into your network. It does inline deduplication compression, and what it also does, which is quite clever, is automatic tiering. We can automate all of the backup of that device as well, so rather than having to have a traditional backup solution, this device will back itself up, and we've got highly efficient, independent, location-independent disaster recovery. And the way that it does this tiering and DR is by effectively hooking at the back end of the device up to Microsoft Azure. So we can tier data out so that the most frequently accessed data stays on the physical device. Data which hasn't been accessed so recently automatically gets tiered out to Azure. So we have a consolidated, one solution which allows you to do your high-speed on-prem storage, but also tiering out your archive data into Azure. So what this allows us to do is to collapse down our primary archive, disk-based backup, remote replication, tape backup, and DR all into one simple device. This allows you to easily manage data growth, vastly reduces your storage costs, much simplifies your data protection and disaster recovery, and ultimately gives your organization business agility. So you're not constantly having to worry about upgrading your SANs and getting new storage. And typically customers which have deployed this have seen somewhere between 40 and 60% reduction in their storage costs. So as you mentioned, the way StoreSimple works is this tiering mechanism. So if you look at the amount of data which you actually access on a day-by-day basis, it's probably quite a small amount of your overall data use. So what StoreSimple does is it's got two tiers on the device itself, so high-speed SSD and slightly slower nearline storage. So the data which you're accessing on a day-to-day basis will be stored within those two tiers, so your users don't have to wait for that data to come down over the wire. It's available to them when they need it. And then automatically, as data has not been accessed for a while, it's tiered out and moved into the cloud. But if a user does want to access some of their archive data, they don't have to go and restore it from an archive, they just go and access it. And then on the fly, that data will then be pulled down onto the StoreSimple device, and it then becomes part of the working set data, so it's then always available whilst that user is using it, and then gradually over time will then get tiered back out to the cloud. So with the new 8000 series, we've taken this one step further as well. So it used to be that the only way to access the data which was stored in Azure was with a physical appliance, but with the new 8000 series, not only have we increased the amount of data storage available on the actual device itself, but we've also released a virtual version of this appliance. So you can now deploy a store simple virtual machine in Azure, and you can then access all of that data which has been tiered up to Azure and then make that available to virtual machines running in Azure. So again, it's a great hybrid story. Some of the workloads are in Azure, some of the workloads are in on-prem, but we've got a common storage fabric that we can use from both of those two different worlds. So the final piece I want to talk about before we wrap up for Q&A is something called Azure Site Recovery. The second biggest challenge that we talk to customers about is how do we do DR and how do we do high availability. I'm sure if you've got DR solutions yourselves, they're probably sitting there, hopefully sitting there, unused almost all of the time. But you're probably a little nervous that did push come to shove and you actually had to fail over onto one of these DR environments, are you 100% sure it would all work perfectly? So there are two models that we can help you with in terms of that. So the first one is if you've got two on-premises data centers and you want to do real-time replication between those. If you are running Windows Server, Hyper-V and System Center, you can use something called Hyper-V Replica to replicate those VMs between the two different sites. And you can do that without Azure. One of the challenges is, though, that were one of those data centers to go down, it's actually quite difficult for you to orchestrate the failover because you've lost access to half of the system. So with Azure Site Recovery, what we've got effectively is a cloud-based service which will be talking to both of those environments from out over the internet. And if one of those environments does go down, it's automatically going to recognize that, and it's automatically going to fail over those workloads to your second data center for you. So it can act effectively as a guardian of this DR solution. The second model we've got there is even more interesting. So rather than having a DR environment yourself, which you have to pay for whether you use it or not, you can actually use Azure as your DR environment. So you can hook up today Azure to your on-prem System Center environment, and it's as easy as saying protect this private cloud. Azure will then take a snapshot of all of those machines on-prem and then set up continuous replication from there so that were anything to ever happen to your on-prem environment, you can immediately fail over to Azure. The nice thing is, though, because Azure is a cloud service, we can spin up all of those DR boxes on the fly. All you have to pay for is the storage of the disks. You only pay for the servers and compute in the event of DR should you have to power up those machines. So it's a much more cost-effective way of doing DR. Some of you might have seen in the press that we acquired a company called InMarge about 3 or 4 months ago. So InMarge will allow us to do the same as we do for System Center on-prem for physical or for VMware or for any other on-prem virtualization solution. So that's something which is coming very soon. I could talk all day about Azure, as I'm sure you can probably tell, but hopefully that's given you a sort of high-level view of what it can do and how it might help you as an organization. So at that point, I'd like to thank you all for your time and open it up for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dan. So yes, as Dan said, if you do have any questions, please do pop those in the questions box, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. We have had a couple of questions come through, so let me just start off with those. So Stephen has asked, is there a data center within the UK?
So unfortunately not. When Microsoft took the decision to build data centers in Europe, they picked Dublin and Amsterdam. There aren't any plans at the moment for the UK, although there are Cloud OS hosting partners in the UK. We and Bytes actually have a facility within Vodafone in the UK which allows you to provide that UK-based hosting for a subset of the Azure services. We typically don't find it's a challenge except in very, very specific scenarios. So healthcare data, for instance, there is a legal requirement that that stays in the UK. But actually, if you drill deep down within the legislation which governs your industry, there are very, very few scenarios where Dublin or Amsterdam won't suffice.
Okay, thank you. And Mike has said, is there anything on the mobile services platform for BlackBerry?
Unfortunately not, no. So it's just iOS, Android and Windows Phone that it supports. I think most of the platform providers are sort of shying away from BlackBerry a bit these days.
Okay, thank you. And George has said, what is my freedom to remain on old versions of software, perhaps even no longer supportable if I'm hosting them on Azure? This is something that theoretically we might choose to do either for financial or compatibility reasons, where our application depends on the functionality of the older software version.
So in theory, yes. The only caveat I would give to that, as we mentioned earlier, is the oldest version of Windows which you can run is Server 2008 R2. On top of that, you can install, pretty much whatever you like, although obviously you have to bear in mind that that might not be fully supported by Microsoft. Another thing that I would encourage you to have a look at, and we'd be happy to follow up with you afterwards, is a solution called AppZero. So AppZero will allow you to take legacy applications running on things like Server 2003 and automatically upgrade those applications so that they will run on Server 2012 without you having to make any modifications to those applications. So it might be worth having a peek at that as well.
Lovely, thank you. And Martin has said, I work for part of the NHS. Can we be certain that data held in Ireland and Holland will never go anywhere else?
Yes, so this is obviously quite relevant at the moment with the various news articles that we've all been seeing. Absolutely. So one of the major kind of benefits of Azure is that you've got full control of where all of that data gets stored, and it's absolutely impossible for that data to leave those two data centers. So there is no danger whatsoever of that getting out.
Lovely. And Camilla has said, I've been testing Azure VPC with the view of using this in our organisation. When I switch off and on a VPC, the IP changes. This is causing trouble to our IT team to open port access. What is your recommended approach for Azure VPC access from a corporate network, please?
So you need to make sure that you have used a reserved IP. This is a new feature which came out a few months ago. Unfortunately, today it's only available via the PowerShell command line. So if you create the virtual machine via the portal, you're correct, it will get a new IP address. But there is quite a simple PowerShell command which you can run, and as part of that PowerShell command, you can specify a persistent IP address, and then it won't change. If you'd like help with that, then please do let us know, and we can send some more info.
Thank you. And also another question from the same person following on from that is, will Azure look after patching and operating system upgrades for all my VPCs?
So within the infrastructure as a service model, no it won't. So you're responsible for doing that. If you can move into the platform as a service world though, so if you can modify your application so that it will work on cloud services or websites, then Azure will automatically upgrade the underlying OS for you. So it depends where that handoff point is. With infrastructure as a service, the handoff point is the virtualization layer. You're responsible for the OS. With cloud services and websites, the handoff point is IIS or the framework that your application is built in. So Microsoft do everything below that for you.
Great. And Mike has said, appreciate the access method is over the internet, but do Microsoft have any guarantee of IOPS performance on Azure storage?
So the first one was access over the internet. There is actually a direct connection into Microsoft Azure, so you can actually run a lease line effectively into the data center so that you can guarantee the performance of that part of it. Today, we don't have the ability to do provisioned IOPS against storage. We do provide the IOPS based on the number of disks which are attached to that virtual machine. So each disk that you attach has 300 IOPS, and you can attach up to 16 of those. So you can get some fairly good performance, but still not as fast as you can get with a real on-prem high-speed SAN. But watch this space is all I can say on that one.
Lovely. And Jonathan has said, I work in a secondary school. Are you seeing much take-up of Azure services in UK schools?
There's quite a few that are using it. So Essex County Council did a big project a year or so ago, hosting information about students in Azure. It's still, I think, a slightly nascent market in education at the moment, but we're definitely starting to see a lot more interest over the last 6 months.
Lovely. And the final question from Mark, where is the best place to start trialling the functionality, or what are the first steps?
So it depends what it is you're looking at doing. We mentioned a couple of the use cases, such as storage. This is probably quite a good one to start with, but I'd encourage you to sign up for a trial. If you want to do some serious stuff with Azure, probably the first thing that you'll have to do is set up a connection to your on-premises environment, so set up a site-to-site connection over the internet. Once you've done that, then you can start spinning up virtual machines, which should hopefully be fairly familiar to you. So very quickly you can get to some virtual servers which you can access from your internal network. I'd then encourage you to have a play with the websites functionality. So anything which you're hosting on IIS today, you can move across into Azure websites. And then finally, the other nice easy one is SQL database. So if you're running any databases on-prem today, you might have some line of business applications or some ticketing systems or things like that. Just try swapping the database out that they run for a SQL Azure database. And even with those three things, I think you'll get a really, really good sense of what the platform is capable of.
Mark has asked another question about Azure. Did you say Azure AD and Store Simple? Are you actually asking how to integrate the AD with Store Simple? Is that yes? Okay. So Store Simple, as we said earlier on with Dan, is basically the appliance which sits in your infrastructure and then links to Windows Azure, Microsoft Azure. Then all the AD functionality is done through Azure AD, and basically all the authentication will be happening in Azure AD, and that is how everything will be accessed either via Store Simple or via another VM, whatever you're using to access those environments. So it uses the Azure.
Just to build on that, so all of the management is done via Azure AD. So if you want to manage your Store Simple with the 8000 series, at least, if you want to manage all of the appliance itself, you log onto the normal Azure portal, and then that will authenticate you using Azure AD, so you can manage it. The actual data which is stored on the appliance itself, as we said, Store Simple is just a nice SCSI target. So you effectively control all of the authentication of the data which is stored on the appliance. So if you have a file server, for instance, and you want to provide the storage to that file server, the file server connects to the storage, and your file server then effectively does all of the authentication and authorization because it's presenting up the network share. So the Store Simple device for the actual data doesn't do the authentication, you do that yourself.
And when you use the 8000 series, where you have the virtual appliance in Azure, there is a configuration file icon there where you click and you manage the device from there, configure it. That is for the virtual one.
Okay, lovely. Well, that's all of the questions that we've had through. So thank you very much for joining us today.